Did the reality war nicely tie up everything set up in Wish World, and what did I think of that ending? So obviously we just got the final episode of Doctor Who Season 2, The Reality War, the second part of the two-part finale with Wish World last week, and off the bat I'm just going to say I watched this at the cinema and I honestly enjoyed most of this episode and had a generally fun time whilst watching it at the cinema, but there are some things in this episode that I'm not a fan of and something that I really hated. So without further ado, let's get into the reality war. So, Wish World ended with the Doctor falling from the balcony of the Bone Palace, and straight off the bat at the start of this episode, he is saved by Anita from Joy to the World, who opens a time door from the Time Hotel. Whilst I didn't love Anita as much as everyone else clearly did in Joy to the World, I think I mentioned that in my Joy to the World review, it is nice to see her here and is a fairly clever way to save the Doctor from that impossible situation, with a nice cameo from a character that people really liked. And that's not to say I don't like Anita, I just didn't love her as much as everybody else did in Joy to the World. So it's revealed that the Wish World keeps resetting the same day over and over again, Groundhog Day style, to make reality thinner to reveal the Underverse. I like this reveal because my favourite part of the last episode was the alternate reality of Wish World itself, so I'm glad that we got to stay in this a little bit longer, even though we don't really do anything else with it in this episode, as the Doctor kind of brings most of the world back to normal anyway, or at least the places that this episode is set in, such as the Unit HQ. So I still do wish they could have done more with the Wish World, like I wanted with last episode as well. Like I said, I watched this episode in the cinema, so I really appreciated the high stakes and the scale of this episode, especially when compared to Empire of Death last year, which weirdly felt kind of low-key and small, even after its high stakes opening of everybody on Earth being turned to dust. I think the battle between Unit and the Bone Beasts felt huge and very cinematic, and I particularly liked the moment with the Doctor riding the Rani's glider through the Bone Beast with his theme blasting. As dumb as it was, I just think watching that moment on the big screen just really made me feel something. And I think this episode just looked great visually overall, floppy digi-double aside, especially on the big screen. So Ruby goes to face off against Conrad using Project Indigo, which is what Martha used while working for Unit in Series 4, and it makes sense that Ruby is the one going to do this given her particular episode this season that focused on her and Conrad. Now going into this episode, I was really worried about what they were going to do with Conrad in this episode. I was thinking they might redeem him, with him giving his life to stop the Rani after he realizes he is being played by them, which I personally would have hated, as I don't think Conrad is set up as a redeemable character in this season. So while I'm glad they didn't do that, I do still find it a little bit weird that they gave Conrad a bit of a happy ending in this episode, but I appreciated that they at least showed that Ruby is annoyed by this at the end of the episode, even though she's the one that wished for it to happen in the first place. Given that we didn't see Omega at the end of last episode, and we only got archive Big Finish audio for him, I wasn't expecting to see him much in this episode, so I wasn't too annoyed when he only appears for less than 5 minutes in this episode, as that's kind of what I expected from him in this anyway. However, I don't think I'm a big fan of the Omega redesign in this episode. They've basically given him the Sutek treatment by turning him into a big CGI monster, which I was worried that they would do again. With that being said, I think this works better than when they did it with Sutek, but I'm not 100% sure why. Maybe it's because he doesn't appear for that long anyway, and the CGI on him is done really well as well, much like with Sutek last year, even though I wasn't a huge fan of that redesign either. Also, I know a lot of people are annoyed with the Doctor defeating Omega by basically blasting him with a huge laser, but for me it seemed pretty obvious that he was just blasting him with a billion supernovas or whatever to send him back to the Underverse, not to kill him, because that would feel very out of character. But obviously it does feel like a bit of an underwhelming resolution to this whole Omega thing. And with that being said, it is also weird seeing the Doctor using the Vindicator as a gun, given that RTD previously said that he redesigned the sonic screwdriver in this era to make it look less like a gun. But at this point, I think RTD is just saying random stuff without even thinking about it.
One day, I think it'll be a companion called Petrol.
And then Omega just eats the Rani and Mrs. Flood escapes using the time ring, so that's that sorted, I guess. So for the most part, with everything that I've discussed so far, I mostly enjoyed this episode. But I was worried every time they kept going back to Poppy in this episode, and I was surprised by how much this episode was focused on Poppy as a character. Obviously, I knew there'd be some focus on her in this episode given the Doctor's comments at the end of Wish World, but I didn't know the main focus of this episode would be Poppy. So like I said, every time you went back to Poppy in this episode, I was worried about where they were going with that. So when we got to the moment where Poppy disappears, as well done as that moment was with Poppy's coat getting smaller and smaller when the Doctor and Belinda were passing it back and forth, I would be lying if I said I wasn't feeling relieved in that moment. But like I said, I do think that moment was done really well, and it's one of those things where different audience members are going to notice what's going on at different times, and I think it was just so well done, especially with Millie Gibson as Ruby. Her reaction to that moment was just so great. Also, I feel like at first it seemed like the Doctor did still remember Poppy, but was keeping quiet about it for the sake of Belinda, because he winks at Ruby at one point. But then the more it goes on, the more it seems like the Doctor has also forgotten about Poppy, which felt very weird. However, I think this is a product of them changing the ending of this episode after Ncuti decided to leave. I feel like this episode was originally going to end not long after Poppy disappeared, with the Doctor remembering Poppy and pretending he doesn't to shield Belinda from the pain, hence why he winks at Ruby. Then the episode probably would have ended with maybe one or two more scenes after that, probably the party scene we've seen an image of, likely with a cameo from Susan setting up the next season, because obviously it's kind of weird that we've been setting up Susan the past couple of episodes and then this episode has nothing to do with her at all. And then potentially with the Doctor going to find Poppy in season 3, with that somehow tying into Susan's origin or something to do with Susan. But after Ncuti decided to leave, they then needed an excuse for him to regenerate, so I think they needed to add some additional scenes with the Doctor going to bring Poppy back, which I don't think was part of the original plan for the end of this episode, which also leads to a very weird ending with Belinda being Poppy's mother, even though that clearly wasn't the case before he changed the timeline, which definitely feels weird and clearly not part of the original plan, given that Poppy is the same as Captain Poppy from Space Babies, so surely she's still out there somewhere, and it just feels like a really weird and out of left field ending for Belinda as a character, which is really unfortunate given how much she's been sidelined in the second half of this season, and she's literally shut in a box for most of this episode and then saddled with a child that she never had, and now she's also all of a sudden fine with the Doctor scanning her child's DNA, which she definitely shouldn't be fine with considering how she felt about the Doctor doing that to her in the Robot Revolution. Anyway, I don't think I heard the rumours or leaks that the 13th Doctor was going to be in this episode, but it is nice to see her in this and was a nice surprise. It feels like a nice passing of the torch between these two Doctors, given that they had David Tennant returning in between them, which honestly makes the ending of this episode feel even more annoying. And I assume they also might have done this to have the first female Doctor and first main black Doctor appear together, and because both of them have had less episodes than every other modern Doctor.
We had longer.
But I do have a feeling this maybe could have been Susan instead, which would have been nice given that we've been hinting at Susan in the past couple of episodes of this season. But like I said, I still really liked this moment and it was nice to see Jodie Whittaker return as the 13th Doctor. Obviously, we've been speculating for a while now that Ncuti Gatwa could be leaving with a surprise or at least unannounced regeneration at the end of this episode, given that he's a very sought after actor who is on the rise at the moment, and we're currently unsure on if Disney Plus are renewing the show, and a third season has yet to have been filmed. I was really hoping he wouldn't go in this episode because I've been really liking him in the past couple of seasons, especially this season, and with the 8 episode format I just don't think he's had enough time. But unfortunately this was Ncuti Gatwa's last episode of his era, so what did I think to that regeneration? Just speaking on the regeneration itself, I think it looks really good. I love the shot of the lights turning out as he's walking to the TARDIS doors, and I love the idea of him regenerating at the TARDIS doors as he's looking out into a nebula, even if I'm not a big fan of it linking to Joy to the World with Joy as a star being there, because I wasn't a big fan of that episode, especially the scene where Joy turns into a star, although it does lead to a nice final line from Ncuti as the 15th Doctor, and I love the visual of the regeneration energy going far into space as if it's a star. Even if maybe the CGI itself wasn't particularly well polished and seemed maybe a little bit unfinished because of probably how little time they had to do this scene, I still think visually as like a concept, I think it looks really nice. But I personally was expecting to cry when the 15th Doctor regenerates, as I've really come to like him, and because of how little episodes he's had, it would have been sad to see him go. But unfortunately, because of what happens next, I just couldn't feel anything in this moment. So I'd heard the rumour that Ncuti Gatwa would be regenerating into Billie Piper at the end of this episode, and when I heard it, if Ncuti Gatwa was going to be leaving, which we also weren't sure about, I didn't expect this to be true, and I honestly hoped it wouldn't be true. I heard there were a couple of alternate endings that they were debating on airing, including this one of which being that this episode would cut to black mid-regeneration, which I personally think is what they probably should have done instead of this, because it leaves it open for either someone new to be cast when they come back, or even for Ncuti to maybe continue when it comes back and when he's available again, if that is something that he obviously would want to do. This isn't anything against Billie Piper as an actor or a person. I think she's great, and I think she could play the Doctor well if that is who she's going to be playing. But honestly, this choice to me just reeks of desperation, and we just did this a couple of years ago with David Tennant, who was literally just before shooting Atwood's 15th Doctor. And I just think you can't just stunt cast every time you're worried that the show is about to be cancelled, especially given that I doubt they even have a plan for this, as it was probably a very last minute decision. There's been a lot of people speculating about what this could mean. Is she the Doctor? Is she the Bad Wolf? Is she Rose? Because she obviously isn't credited as the Doctor in the credits, which a lot of people have been pointing out. And frankly, I personally think they've just done this because they aren't even sure yet either. Because like I said, I think this was just a very last minute decision of them trying to desperately make sure the show doesn't get cancelled and make sure people are still talking about it. Like I've said, I mostly enjoyed this episode, but that was up until this point with only a couple of gripes and minor issues. And this moment just really brought down the whole episode for me. I've never been one of those people to say Russell T Davies needs to leave. I've mostly been thinking that's just a very unfair thing to say. While I like seeing new talent in this show and was happy to see the amount of new guest writers this season, and would have liked to have just seen him gradually get less and less involved in the writing of the show, being more of a producer and showrunner, I'm now starting to agree with people saying that it's time for him to leave after this. We just did this a couple of years ago with David Tennant, and that made sense as it was part of an anniversary special, whereas this to me just reeks of desperation. You could argue that they've done this to celebrate this being 20 years since the revival, with its first episode being Rose, but this kind of stunt casting so soon after doing it in the 60th just doesn't sit right with me. Overall, although I was mostly enjoying this episode whilst watching it, especially watching it on the big screen with its epic scale and some fantastic visuals, the ending of this episode just really kills it for me. Although I think Billie Piper is a great actor who could definitely pull off the role of the Doctor if that is who she's playing, it reeks of desperation, especially after we just did this a couple of years ago with David Tennant, and it really makes me think we need to see something or someone new for this show. Whether that be a new actor taking on the role that isn't someone we've seen in the past, or even a new showrunner and writer taking over the show. If it weren't for that ending and maybe a couple of the gripes that I have with this episode, such as the stuff with Poppy and the sidelining of Belinda and abandonment of her character, I honestly think I would have liked this episode more than Empire of Death. But for that reason, I just personally can't get on board with this. And like I said, that ending just really kills it for me. But those are my thoughts on the last episode of Doctor Who Season 2, The Reality War. Let me know what you thought about this episode in the comments down below. I will be coming back soon with some more videos, including a video where I'll be discussing this series as a whole and ranking every episode. I guess now as well, because Shooty's leaving, I will also be doing one of those for his whole era. I'll of course be talking about the trailer for The War Between the Land and the Sea as well. And as we're nearly reaching it being a whole year since Season 1 finished airing, I might also be doing a video on that as well. And there's a couple of other ideas I have as well for the future, so if you don't want to miss those, make sure you subscribe below. But with all that being said, thanks for watching.